afternoon. Welcome to Legal Talk with Tracy Sanders. So you probably hear some very interesting music in the background. It's from a movie, A Civil Action, starring John Travolta. Many of you probably remember that movie back in the 1990s. And the reason why that movie is very relevant to our topic today is because it's related to environmental pollutants and, unfortunately, disease that may result because of toxins. So today's topic is toxic torts, legal and medical issues. We're going to go through everything you need to know about toxic torts and product liability in terms of the law as well as medicine. Unfortunately, there's another case that you might remember. Julia Roberts played Erin Brockovich back in the 90s as well. And that was another movie that was related to toxic torts and diseases that can result from environmental pollutants. So it's just important to keep in mind that even though we enjoyed those movies, people are suffering in real life every day. So what should you do if you feel that you might have been exposed to toxins at work, at home, in the environment, or even through pharmaceuticals? You should definitely contact an attorney. And if you have been personally injured and you are possibly suffering from disease, you should let your doctor know right away. So speaking of doctors and lawyers, I have esteemed guests with me in the room today. I'd first like to start with our first guest, who's an attorney at the Cochran Firm, California, and then we'll go around the room and ask our guests to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, Tracy. My name is Marcelis Morris. I am an attorney at the Cochran Firm in California. I am the leader of our personal injury practice and our mass tort practice.
I can't believe that you're in leadership. You look like you just graduated from law school.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
But I know that you're doing a fine job, so thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next.
Yes, good afternoon, Tracy. I am Dr. Linda James. I'm a family practice physician. I've been practicing for about 13, 14 years now.
Also, Dr. James is my coalition sister. We are both members of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women Los Angeles chapter, so thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I also believe you are the chair of the Health Committee, correct?
Yes, I am.
So we will speak with Dr. James more, and we will provide information how you can reach out to her if you're here in the Los Angeles area and you'd like to become involved in our elite organization.
Hello, everyone. My name is Timaiah Smith, and I'm actually a third-year JD MBA student at Loyola Marymount and Loyola Law School here in Los Angeles, California.
And could you tell us, Timaiah, why are you excited about being here today?
Honestly, I am beyond excited. I have always had an interest in product liability and really wanted to learn more about toxic torts, so this is the ideal opportunity for me to do so.
And we are so happy that you're here. And I would also encourage you to keep in touch with Attorney Morris after the session today. He would be a wonderful mentor for you, and I'm volunteering him.
Thank you so much.
So you're both from Loyola Law School.
Yes,
we
wonderful. So why don't we get started with our topic for today? So toxic torts. First question is for Attorney Morris. We hear the term torts a lot, and you and I and Timaiah know that term because we learned in law school. But what about those in the audience who might not know, what are we talking about? What is a tort?
So the essence of what a tort is basically it's a civil wrong. A tort is a concept that is directed at understanding where liability lies when someone has done something to someone else and caused harm. That's in essence what a tort is.
So a tort is a civil wrong.
Yes, it is.
And when you were in law school, our first year was called 1Ls, did you know during that time that you would practice product liability and toxic torts?
I did not know that. I have since fallen in love with it, but I did not know.
So I'd like to ask, could you please distinguish what is the difference between a toxic tort litigation case and product liability litigation?
Yes, they're definitely distinct, but at the same time there's a lot of overlap between the two, or there can be a lot of overlap between the two. Product liability litigation is involving products that cause harm to other people. When a person purchases something and gets in contact with a product, they may use it in a certain way that might cause them harm.
Okay.
Now, segueing over to toxic torts, we're still talking about a civil wrong, but in that arena, the mechanism of injury has to do with exposure to a toxin.
Perfect. And Tony is operating our PowerPoint. So when the PowerPoint comes up, I actually have a diagram in the PowerPoint where I have little bubbles in terms of different areas of exposure. A person can be exposed to toxins in their home, at work, at school, environmental toxins, and then possibly pharmaceutical toxins. So I'd like to ask Dr. James, can you tell us how a person may be harmed in terms of pharmaceutical toxins?
For pharmaceutical toxins, you're going to look at maybe the side effects from medications. That's the major way, because with the pharmaceuticals that the FDA regulates, we know what the chemical makeup of that medication is, and that is a long process of how it's going to come to market to be allowed to be purchased for the community.
So, Dr. James, I'd like to back up a step. You mentioned the FDA, so we're referring to the Food and Drug Administration.
Correct.
But I don't want to scare our audience away and think, oh no, I'm not filling this prescription, it could kill me or harm me. Are medicines in the United States generally safe in the marketplace?
Yes, it will take maybe 12 years for a medication to be approved by the FDA. There's a long process. I'm going to pass around to everyone the process of how the FDA can get medications approved. I'll pass this one to that way. If people want to comment on it, they can comment on it as well. But let me briefly go over that. So you have preclinical and the clinical trials of medication. The preclinical is when you're actually making the compound. You do animal testing, and that can take 3 to 5 years. Then the phase 1 is now you're talking about clinical. So you'll have people volunteer to do scientific studies. So you might have maybe 20 to 80 people that would do the first phase. These are healthy people first to be tested on the drug. Then the next group is the phase 2. These are actual patients that have the disease, and that might be 100 to 300 people. After you do that phase, that could take 2 years as well. Then the next phase would be phase 3. You pick more sick people, maybe like 1,000, to see the safety, the effectiveness of the disease or the medication on the disease. Then after they finish that process, takes 3 years possibly, you go into now your application to get it approved by the FDA.
And I know there are also patent applications, so you're referring to approval through the FDA
only. This has nothing
FDA
to do with
only.
their patent at all. This just has to do with, can this pharmaceutical medication be used in the United States?
So it's used in the United States. And I had meant to ask, sometimes there are studies abroad as well, correct?
Exactly. And I was about to say, and that's why you'll have medications that are used in other countries. And sometimes when they've been used other countries and you have other studies, we can then take those studies, and then it might not take the 12 years to get it approved because we've seen the effects in other countries.
Perfect. And you came very prepared. Love it. Thank you. I'd like to ask Timaiah. So Dr. James has eloquently taken us through the process in terms of drug approvals and clinical studies. But she mentioned that drugs are sometimes tested on animals, tested on humans, and we've heard atrocious stories about tests abroad. What about the ethics involved? Do you think it's ethical for us to use these drugs on animals and possibly poor people in the United States who may be paid for clinical studies, and those overseas who might not have any type of regulatory agencies to monitor the studies? What do you think about that?
Honestly, I feel as though it is a catch-22 because, of course, we have so many people who fall ill and need these medications to help them get better and honestly save their lives. But then you look at it where there are animals who honestly have no control over their autonomy, and we're subjecting them to things that could honestly harm them, kill them. So I do believe that in some regards it's very much so troublesome, but I do think that it's like, what else, what other options, what other alternatives are there for us to ensure that we as humans can actually take this medication to get well.
So for all the PETA people who may be watching us, people who love animals as well as those who are concerned about human rights, it's pretty much a necessary evil. And Attorney Morris, I'm coming around to you next. He will probably tell you in terms of torts what we learn are public policy concerns and public policy value. And one important public policy element here is going to be safety and saving lives and using the clinical studies for the common good. So even though some may be harmed, we would like to think is helping more people than harming. Okay. So I'd like to go back to Attorney Morris, and then we're going to go to Dr. James. Attorney Morris, I want to ask you briefly if you could tell us, are there statute of limitations in terms of if a person may have been exposed? And then we're going to go right to Dr. James because she's going to give us a list of common diseases in tort cases. And then she also has some more information to share. But before we go to Dr. James, tell us about the statute of limitations.
Okay, so briefly, as you recommended, a statute of limitations is a period of time with which you have to bring a civil action from an injury or any other wrong that's been done to you. In products liability and in toxic tort litigation, the statute of limitations is generally 2 years. But there's also what's called the discovery doctrine, which what it does is it puts the burden on the person to acquire the information that's needed in order for them to understand that they have been harmed. So you might have someone that's exposed to a toxin. The statute of limitations, or the 2 years, wouldn't necessarily start at the moment when they're being exposed, but it might be at a later date when they're diagnosed with a disease. And even then, once they're diagnosed with that disease, the statute of limitations may not run because they may not know that that disease is associated with a product.
Exactly. And I have to ask, and then I'll go through some common chemicals in tort cases, and then I'll ask Dr. James to take us through some common diseases. When you mention a statute of limitations, is that in California or everywhere across the United States?
So there are statutes of limitations in all states, but the ones that I'm speaking about, the 2-year rule and then the discovery rule, that's in the state of California.
Thank you. So I will briefly go through a few of the chemicals commonly seen in toxic tort cases because Attorney Morris had mentioned exposure. So you might be thinking, exposure to what? Well, it could be nerve agents, it could be mercury, asbestos, benzene, beryllium, dioxins, manganese, PCB, pesticide, silica, HC, and chromium oxide. And now we'd like to ask Dr. James, what are some diseases that may result from exposure?
So the common diseases in toxic tort cases are aplastic anemia, asbestosis, berylliosis, bisonosis, Hodgkin's disease, interstitial lung disease, leukemia, lymphoma, mesothelioma, multiple myeloma, pneumoconiosis, sarcoidosis, silicosis, and thrombocytopenia purpura.
And Dr. James, you were going to add more.
Yeah, I was going to mention about the testing of animals. A lot of the testing is done on rats. So even with the testing of rats, the scientists really do try to be humane with what we do to the animals. Even if we go from rats and up, or pigs, we do it humanely. I used to do research, and we did research on rats, and it was necessary, and we did it humanely.
Thank you for adding that. And I'd like to ask Timaiah, what are your thoughts?
I just think that, like you said, like the fact that it's necessary for us to get, the treatment that we need, and just the fact that it's done humanely just kind of makes it a bit more, you feel more comfortable with the thought of that because you know that no one's intentionally harming these animals. They're doing it to ultimately better society and help people who are really struggling with these illnesses from exposure.
Well, thank you both. And now we'd like to basically remind you of the different types of exposure. So I had mentioned pharmaceutical exposure, occupational exposure, environmental exposure, work, home, and school exposure. So now I'd like to focus a little more on occupational exposure. Can you tell us about the agencies that may protect workers from toxins in the workplace, and what should a person do if they feel they've been exposed to toxins at work?
So this is actually an area I'm sure Dr. James knows a lot about. There is an agency called OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Agency, that it's a governing body within the state of California that is involved with ensuring that workers are safe. And one of the reasons that this agency and these bodies are so important is because one of the primary sources of exposure to toxins is in the workplace.
Wow. Do the employers know, or why?
Oftentimes you have industrial exposures. So you have people in the steel industry, in the aluminum industry, in clean rooms.
What about coal mines?
There's definitely a lot of toxins involved with coal mines. Actually, within the coal mines, one of the toxins that's most common is natural gas. And the toxins that are within the natural gas that can cause exposures to the people who are in the mines, in addition to the dust and things like that could enter the body.
And I know that most people have heard about like black lung litigation and whatnot. Hopefully some of that has curbed. But what can an employer do to protect themselves? First of all, protect their workers, and then protect that company from liability in terms of toxins in the workplace.
So the first thing that an employer should do to protect their workers is to understand the toxins that their workers are working with. And from there, understand what are the hazards and dangers associated with those toxins. You can't protect against a harm that you're not familiar with. And from there, and some employers can actually hire consultants and hire other firms to come in and evaluate their processes to ensure that they're safe. But they should always be evaluating what they call PPE, or personal protective equipment, and ensuring that the personal protective equipment that's assigned to each employee is adequate for the exposures that you're expecting that they will be engaging with.
And then could you tell us about some toxins in schools? I mean, we've heard about lead paint and water and things of that nature. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So as you were explaining, lead paint, water, those are definitely two very important and significant sources of exposure in schools. The Cochran firm is actually presently investigating an exposure at a middle school in the state of California that is right next to a cell phone tower.
Oh, no.
And we expect that it has caused a proliferation of brain cancer in minors in that area.
Well, I'm glad you are working on the case, and I'm pretty sure the outcome will be favorable to students and people in that neighborhood. What about toxins in the home?
So toxins in the home are many. There's cleaning agents. Really anything can be a toxin, because really something being toxic is more about dose. It's how much of it is coming into your body. Toxins or chemicals are everywhere. They're in the air, they're on surfaces, but when it becomes toxic is when it becomes harmful to the human body.
So this is more, now we're going into product liability rather than toxic torts. But when you said that, this is a true story when you mentioned use. So if I use bleach, and I remember, this is a true story, before I took bar exam and passed it in Connecticut, the night before the bar exam, I actually had to go to the emergency room because I think I was nervous, and I'm like a person who cleans. I don't know, I was like nervous, and I started cleaning. I guess it's better than eating, right? Or doing something illegal. But I clean when I'm like thinking about stuff, and I mixed up bleach with another cleaning agent, and I have like asthma and respiratory problems, and I ended up like trying to wipe my face, so I had a burn on the side of my face, this is a true story, and asthma. Went to the emergency room the night before and still passed the bar. The bar examiners probably thought she just drifted in from a homeless shelter because I had that patch on my face, but I passed the bar. But my question is, for someone like me who mixed those chemicals, or someone else at home maybe cleaning, is the product company responsible if we use the products in that way, mixing and doing those things, not reading the directions?
So one of the things you were saying goes back to something I mentioned earlier on, which is there's a crossover between products liability and toxic torts, because you can have products that have toxins.
I see.
So you can have a product that's just defective in and of itself, or you can have a product that's defective because of the chemicals that are used in it. So there's a variety of ways of holding companies responsible or liable for their products. Generally, we have what's called strict products liability. So what that means is no matter how careful a company is trying to be, if their product is defective or deemed defective, then they are responsible.
But what if I misused the product by mixing bleach with Pine Sol or something crazy, and then there's fumes and I'm sick and I have asthma? Am I responsible?
So that's very important, because in the doctrines of products liability, there is this expectation that people will use the products in a foreseeable way or in a way that it's intended to be used.
I see.
Now, just because you've misused a product doesn't necessarily mean that the product maker is not responsible, because sometimes a misuse can be foreseeable. For example, people taking a few extra steps on a ladder is probably not safe, but also is foreseeable.
I see. So I'd like to ask Timaiah, does any of this resonate with you in terms of your first year torts class?
Yes, I am taking a stroll down memory lane. I remember I took torts we took a full year of torts, and all of this is just wow, I remember that. Foreseeable. Yeah, it has to be foreseeable. Yeah, that makes sense. I remember. So it's so interesting just to hear how those things that you learned in school will now be applied as you're in your profession. So it's good to know that you're not wasting 3 or 4 years in law school, you're actually going to use this information as a practicing
Not
attorney.
at all, because when you hear the legal terms, it makes sense in terms of applying it to everyday life.
Right.
But what about misuse of products? Do you think consumers bear some responsibility to read the directions and use products wisely?
I definitely do, especially when you're dealing with something as toxic as, cleaning supplies and things that we use. But once again, when he says foreseeable use, I will clean with bleach. I have a puppy, he's very messy, so maybe I'm cleaning with bleach and I'm cleaning with Pine Sol, my house is a mess, I need to clean up. So it's foreseeable that you would sometimes use those products together. It's not something that's just not normal. So I think in cases like that, I do think that the creator or the maker of that product should bear the risk that might come from it.
I'd like to ask Dr. James, so in terms of workers' compensation, because basically that's probably where you will see our clients in terms of those who've been injured in the workplace. Have you treated some patients workers' compensation, and what do you think about safety in the home, workplace, schools?
Yes, I have treated patients, and what I normally tell patients, depending on what their exposure was, for example, if chemicals that they've been involved in, if they have asthma, I would suggest that they do more natural types of cleansers like vinegar, baking soda, things of that nature, so they won't expose themselves to the toxic chemicals, or buy more natural products.
And then what about workers' compensation cases? Do you handle any of those?
I do have some of those. Like I said, it depends on what the issue is, what the exposure was, and what the injury actually, or the mechanism of the injury. So it varies, so I can't quite give specific on that.
Yes.
But if it's something in the working environment, that's going to be, if they say they had exposure to asbestos at their job, for example, then we're going to do all the studies that pertain to diagnosing asbestos, for example, and then the letter they may get from us would be that they are not allowed to work in that environment.
Yes.
We're going to give the limitations so that they can not be exposed to that.
And Dr. James, what should someone do if they feel they have been exposed to toxins at work? What is the very first step in terms of medical precautions?
Yeah, the first thing, you want to make an appointment to come to your doctor's office. If you know what you've been exposed to, you might want to bring the literature. Like a lot of the jobs would know what they've been exposed to, so you want to bring that information with you to your doctor's office, because sometimes your doctor may not have been aware of that particular chemical, especially if you work in a lab. So you want to bring that, and then that way they can look it up and they can see what else is needed, instead of just doing the workman's comp, to go to OSHA, because they'll have all those things, or call the company that it was made from, and then determine what else is needed.
That's perfect. So that now I'll circle back to Attorney Morris. So Dr. James has given some great information in terms of what to do from a medical standpoint, but we know that people are concerned about losing their jobs. And we know that there are also concerns about whistleblowing in the workplace. So legally, what should a worker do if they believe they have been exposed at work?
So one of the first things they should do is ensure that their employer is aware of it, so that the employer can do something about it if they're going to do something about it. But of course, as you were alluding to, there is the possibility of retaliation and people who are reporting the fact that they've been exposed to chemicals being retaliated against for having made a report. But I think that one of the first things they should do is tell their employer first off, and if they believe that their legal rights are being jeopardized in some way, shape, or form, they should contact a lawyer, definitely, in order to properly evaluate their case and determine what steps they should take to preserve their job, to preserve their rights.
And so I'd also like to ask, you provided excellent information about the discovery rule and the statute of limitations in California, 2 years. But if a person believes they've been exposed and perhaps they are now starting to be symptomatic, what should the person do to try to link the connection between toxin at work and now I'm sick? Like take photos or keep records? So what can we do to collect evidence?
That's a very important question. When someone feels that they've been exposed to a toxin, what they should do is go to someone like Dr. James and try to have a medical professional to understand what's going on. Because what you're talking about is someone that's having symptoms, but you don't know where those symptoms are coming from. You don't know what they're caused by. So you need a doctor in order to evaluate what could be causing those symptoms. Now, if you know that you work in an environment that has toxins, let's say you work around semiconductors, and so you're using toxic chemicals on a daily basis, you might go to your employer and try to determine, well, what chemicals am I around every day that could be causing these symptoms. But I think the most important thing to do when you feel that you're being exposed to something is to go to the doctor. But as you were saying, it is important to take photographs, take notes, write things down, ask questions, and some people can do research on their own on the computer and trying to figure out what's going on. But as I was saying before, it can be important to go to a lawyer as well, because even if you don't retain a lawyer at that time, the questions that they ask of you might give you information regarding what information you should be gathering. They may say, well, do you have any photographs? Do you have any documentation from your employer? What chemicals have you been around? And so that might give you a guide to what information you should be collecting.
So we're going to give Timaiah a hypothetical. I know you're getting ready for final exams, so
don't remind me.
This is a hypothetical. But I'm going to ask, so let's say a person is working in an environment where there are toxins, they've seen the doctor. What time period do you think is reasonable before that person should say, hey, I need to start collecting evidence. I think that I might have been exposed. Do you think it's a certain time frame that we deem as reasonable in the law?
I would say reasonably, just because we're dealing with health and something that could be life-threatening. I think that that's something that should be done immediately, just for the sake of preserving your life and making sure that you can mitigate whatever harms have come from that exposure. But I would say at most a few months, like nothing more than that, just for health concerns, like not even from the legal aspect, because I think like your life is probably what's most important, and I think so that's something that should be handled as soon as you can.
Okay, so I like what you said immediately, but we have an expert in the room. Attorney Morris?
Yes, I do have some comments on that. And I have the lawyer's response, which is, it depends.
Oh, no.
It depends.
Say that.
It depends. Well, what's reasonable? Here's an example. You were mentioning earlier that you've had asthma.
I do.
Right?
Yes.
So let's say the toxin that you're around is causing breathing problems. You may just think it's your asthma. So you might go a year thinking, I'm just having really terrible asthma. A year goes by, it gets worse and worse and worse. So you go back to your asthma doctor and they say, or your pulmonologist, and they say, actually, are you being exposed to any chemicals at the job? Or you may not learn that it's a chemical until it's many, many, many months. So in that case, can we just place upon you the limitation that you have to come in 3 weeks or 3 months? And it also depends on the severity of the reaction. Sometimes it's just a rash. Sometimes if you lose sight in one eye, I think 1 day is probably reasonable.
Then it's immediate, as Timaiah has stated. Right. Dr. James, do you think it helps to go to the doctor as much as possible in terms of journaling and documenting these symptoms? So if it's months later and it's actually related to a toxin at work, does going to the doctor help create a record?
It definitely helps, because you might have the symptoms only at work, Like for example, if you have allergies, it might just be when you are at that job. And then on the weekends, you're fine because you're not at work. So that's also an indication that for sure it is the job that is causing this problem for you. Or when you go to your cousin's house, they have some kind of exposure and you only feel sick there. Or if it's something that's progressively getting worse. So you do want to go to your doctor so you can establish that.
Great. And when you mention someone's home, that is going to take me to our next topic in terms of exposure, environmental exposure. And the reason why home clicked for me is because right now we see a lot of cases in the media about water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and other places across the United States. So Attorney Morris, could you tell us about environmental exposure and in particular the water crisis?
So, as you might expect, an environmental exposure is an exposure to a toxin that's come into the environment. And when an environmental exposure happens in the home, more often than not, it's because the home is close to some industrial center. So you have these toxic nuisances in the air, you have smoke, or you have some radiation or some chemical that's coming from a plant. And one of the things that becomes a problem is if any of those chemicals get into the water. And that's when you have chemicals that can travel long distances. That's one of the challenges with water, is because oftentimes the chemicals can't be seen, they can't be smelled, they can't be tasted, but yet they're in the water, and then the water becomes this natural distribution system of spreading this chemical everywhere. That's why it's one of the most hazardous and harmful ways of being exposed to a toxin.
And I know we would need a scientist in the room to really go through detail, but so my hometown, I claim two states. I claim New York, similar to Dr. James, and then I've always claimed my home state of South Carolina. And there have been some places in South Carolina, Alabama, the deep South, where we have really old piping systems and wells, and you wouldn't believe that it's the United States of America. But does it matter where we live? Are some water systems more advanced than others in the United States?
Absolutely. Depending on where you are, in rural towns, for example, the water system could just be a well, which is something that's much harder to fix because it's not based on pipes necessarily. It's harder to move. You can't just move a well. You could maybe develop one or build one, but the type of system you have definitely matters. If you have steel pipes versus iron pipes, you can have those pipes deteriorating over time, which can cause more exposures, especially if the pipes have lead or some type of metal or mercury. So it definitely depends. When you're in rural towns, usually the water systems are not maintained in the same way, and they're usually older, and as a result, you can actually have chemicals leaching into the water system from the soil around it. So it may not be the system itself, but it could just be the deterioration of the system over time that's allowing, let's say, a fertilizer that's in the soil to leach into the water and then to the home.
So in that particular instance, who should we hold responsible if the water is contaminated and it becomes an environmental pollutant?
It depends. The lawyer's response.
Yes.
In that scenario, you are looking for what entity or person was in the best position to prevent the contamination and know about it. So in that scenario, it could be a plant that's dumping its chemicals outside of its facility. Now, it may not know specifically that the chemicals are getting into the soil and then the soil is leaching into the pipes, but what they should know is that this chemical shouldn't be dumped because guess what? It could harm people. It can get into the water supply, it can get into the pipes.
So we have a question for our law student. You probably learned about governmental immunity. So for example, and not talking too much about Flint, Michigan, because that is not why we're here, but just using that as an example because that's what a lot of people know about. But say if it's Flint, Michigan, or anywhere in the United States, do you think that public officials should use governmental immunity as a way to say, hey, we're not responsible. We didn't know what was in that water?
Honestly, that was the subject that I had the hardest time reconciling in tort law, because a lot of times when they can pull or they can claim government immunity, it's like, well, who was the best person who was in the position to prevent that harm? There's honestly no one else who would have the capacity or the wherewithal or the resources to prevent this besides the government officials. So in those instances, I really don't feel as though government immunity should even be something that can be claimed. But of course, the law is much bigger than what I think should be able to occur. But it's just a very tough situation, I think.
But it starts with what we're doing now, information and discussion, and you have a lot more power than you're giving yourself credit for. You are the future, and your generation, you are in a position to make these changes, and you will have to fix these pipes that are out of control and old.
Right.
So thank you for being involved in this practice area and hopefully being involved with the solutions. So now I'd like to ask Dr. James, in terms of water contamination, and I'll go back to Attorney Morris to kind of figure out the legality of if someone is harmed through an environmental pollutant, what should they do? But bottled water is the rave now. You all have water. I put some in your Cochrane Firm bags. Dr. James, is this regulated by the FDA, bottled water?
No, it's not. But there are a lot of groups doing testing. There's individual groups that do testing. You can get water testing kits if you're concerned, and then just go online. And today I actually pulled off, and you can go to different sites and you can see the comparisons of the water. And one of the waters there just looked at various things from alkalination to pH to is it environmentally friendly? How are they getting the water? Are they filtering it, etc.? So I like that because it told us so much, and then it rated each one. So depending on which water you're getting, from Fiji to Artisan or whoever you're getting, it gave a nice rating at the end. So you can look at that and see what's important to you.
But I'd like to know, so all bottled water is not equal?
All water bottled is not equal, nor is it considered better than tap water.
Really? So why are we spending so much money?
That's the question, why?
You mean sometimes water in bottles might not be any better in terms of quality or health than
it may
tap
not be
water?
any better than the tap water, but your tap water may be better than the bottled water you're getting. You might not be doing anything additional to it.
So is that where the testing kit would then...
That would help. If you're concerned about, if you still want to buy bottled water, then you want to look at which one you're purchasing, and depending on what criteria you're interested in. I liked the Fiji water because that one was actually given back to the community, and it met a lot of the criteria that I was looking for. And then there was a Hawaiian water that was the best. It had a 9.
Wow.
So,
but in terms of in the marketplace that we usually go and see, Fiji, Smart, and all these other brands.
Fiji was the best one.
Like Fiji.
The more common ones based on the ones that they compared.
Okay, so I'd like to say, if you're listening and you work for Fiji, please sponsor Legal Talk with Tracy Sanders, because we are giving you a huge pitch right now, and I accept donations and money, so thank you. But I'd like to go back to Attorney Morris in terms of what has been stated. So is it illegal or untruthful if someone has a water bottling company and they say this water is from Hawaii, but it might come from someplace in LA? Do we really know where this water is coming from, and is it against the law if it's not truthful labeling?
The short answer is, you're correct. It's not. I mean, it's not legal. That's false advertising. Something that's on a label should accurately reflect what's within the container. So if you have a product that says it's from Fiji, but it's from Arizona, that's false advertising.
But how do we really know where this water is coming from? Do you think that most companies are being truthful and accurate in terms of telling us which spring or town or city it's from?
I would say the best way to know that is to look at the label. The companies that publish where they're getting their water from on the label are more likely to be more accurate in providing you with information about where the water is coming from. So what you want to be wary of is bottles of water that don't tell you anything about where it's coming from.
So it's safer if it states where it's from. We can rest assured that most companies are not foolish enough as to blatantly, do something that would cause them to possibly face a lawsuit. Then in terms of the connection between environmental pollutants and health, so what's the connection? So if it's a toxin at work, I can clearly make a nexus. If it's a toxin in my home, lead paint, I can make a nexus. School, like you said, cell towers nearby, there's a nexus. But the environment is the environment. So how in the world can people generally tie an environmental pollutant to disease?
It's very challenging. Oftentimes it's just paying attention to your body and paying attention to your environment and paying attention to what chemicals and toxins are around you, in your environment, in your work, in your home, reading labels. And it can be very challenging. And this is actually one of the challenges of toxic torts, period, is the chemicals are everywhere.
Okay.
They're on the surfaces, they're in the air, they're in your gasoline, they're on your car, they're in your car.
So they're unavoidable.
They're unavoidable. So how do you draw that link, that causal nexus? One of the ways is by going to your doctor. The doctor may actually have information. So if you're someone that's suffering from breathing problems, your doctor may find that you have asbestosis, or they may find that, let's say you have some other disease, they may find that you have mesothelioma. They may find you have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And oftentimes the doctors are skilled in drawing that link. So they know if someone has a lymphoma, maybe ask them, okay, what do you do for work? Are you exposed to PCBs, for example, which can cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
And so I had mentioned a class action in Erin Brockovich, and in both of those movies, and I would strongly suggest those, young ladies, probably before your time, but it's definitely good for you as a law student because it will show you how this practice area actually works and plays out in communities that are affected. But I had wanted to ask, is it also helpful when you have a class action versus an individual alleging harm?
It can be very helpful. The reason is there's power in numbers. When you have a class action and you've been able to collect a number of individuals together who have gone through the same thing with the same force and the same resources, all moving in the same direction, you can affect more change that way oftentimes. You can get companies to listen when you've got 200 people, 300, maybe 1,000 people who are all saying, I have been affected by this chemical or by this plant that's nearby or by this contaminated water. So it can be helpful.
And Dr. James, do you think that it would help in terms of making a medical diagnosis if you see a lot of people in the same town or in the same school, in the same home community who are all suffering from the same symptoms?
Yes, that's definitely helpful. That's one of the things that the CDC looks at, or the local health department.
And that's a perfect point, because I actually have this pulled up and I wanted to ask you about the agency. So could you tell us what is the CDC and what level of government is that?
It's the Center for Disease Control. And
then what does the CDC do with respect to toxic torts and product liability?
I would defer to our...
Okay. So when you said the CDC, I'm thinking from a medical perspective, you are sending data and collecting information,
From a medical
correct?
standpoint, if there's something that, as a physician, I feel is hitting the whole community locally,
yes,
then I'm going to report this to the health department. Then I'm also going to maybe also send maybe samples of the patient's blood or biopsies or things of that nature to the CDC if I feel it's at that level.
And then if you have a lot of people in a community that are affected, would you then send group samples so they can see if all of these people are affected possibly by the same disease or illness or toxin?
No, not necessarily group, but when the bird flu hit several years ago, a lot of the community clinics were overwhelmed with it, so we were sending our samples to the health department, asking them exactly what should we do. We're seeing this new disease. All of these children, these elderly patients are coming in with this. What do you want us to do? This is something irregular than what we're used to. This is not just the flu season.
Wow. So it does help, as we have discussed. We don't want anyone to be ill, but when you're trying to figure out the cause of illness, if you see common patterns or a lot of people from the same area being affected, then obviously there is a commonality in terms of what caused it. And then you also mentioned the local agency. So the California Department of Health, I believe, is the state agency. Is that correct? And then the local agency is the LA Department of Public Health.
Yes.
And so if a person feels that they have been exposed to a toxin in their homes, in school, or in the environment, or at work, someone reach out to the local and state agencies or health departments? And can those agencies help in terms of inspections or collecting data?
Yes, they can.
Okay, great. So this one is what I'm holding in my hand. I'll pass it around. It says, this is from the State of California Health and Human Services Agency. California Department of Health is an abatement of lead hazards notification, and it's posed at all entrances to work area and structure. So we'll pass this around as a sample. And then also, Dr. James was 100% correct when I asked her about the bottled water. I have a notice here that said certification, neither EPA nor FDA certifies bottled water. However, consumers may notice a logo or seal from other organizations that will test the water. So thank you so much. You were correct about that. We also spoke about keeping kids safe. And Attorney Morris mentioned that if it is an issue in your school or your home or environmental exposure, you should first track your symptoms, see a doctor, and definitely reach out to a lawyer such as Attorney Morris who practices in that area, because you want to make sure that you put your health as a top priority. So I'd like to end our discussion with our guests before we go to our final segment in the news by asking Dr. James, I'm holding in front of me, it says health tips. And there's a connection here between healthy body, healthy mind, healthy spirit. Could you please leave us with a few health tips in terms of what should we all do, even though Attorney Morris mentioned these toxins are everywhere, it's unavoidable. What can we do to keep ourselves healthy and safe?
We should all exercise. We should all drink water, depending on what type of water you want to drink, whether tap water, whether bottled water. If you are concerned about your water, you want to look at your area. You can check the water, your local water company, and they can tell you what your water levels are, and they periodically do testing. You can test it yourself. You can have people come out to do that. If you're concerned, you can also have filtration system in your home if you're that concerned, and still use your tap water. And you can see what level of contaminants are in your water at home. But we do encourage water versus juice and other things like that, especially no sodas. So if you exercise, keep your body healthy. Also, you want to buy organic as well if you're concerned about pesticides and other chemicals. Organic food is better. If you don't buy organic, at least peel your fruit, wash it. Those are things that will help you be more healthy. And then meditation is a good thing for your mind and spirit.
I said yes. I had a meditation therapist last week. Her name is Noelle Chaco, and it certainly helps because if we think about everything that's out there and in the air, it can make you feel unsafe and anxious. But you're right. Do the best we can and meditate. Remain calm. How can our audience find you if they need a good doctor here in the LA area?
I work at the Medicina Clinica. This is in Van Nuys, so you can find me there.
Okay, great. And we'd like to ask Attorney Morris to maybe give us one or two legal tips to wrap up and let us know how we can find you at the Cochran Firm, California, if there are concerns about product liability or toxic torts litigation.
I guess one thing I wanted to mention that's very important is with respect to statutes of limitations, talk to your lawyer, call a lawyer, because there's a lot of rules out there that can bar your ability to file your claim. So it's important that you have that evaluated by a lawyer as quickly as possible. For example, we were talking about governmental agencies and entities. The rules are different for them. Usually it's only 6 months, not 2 years. So that's a very important tip, is if you feel as if your legal rights have been jeopardized or are at stake, talk to your lawyer right away.
That lawyer would be you.
Yes, and if anyone's trying to get a hold of me or in touch with our office, they can either call 1-800-THE-FIRM, which is our national phone number, or they can come find me in Mid-City, Los Angeles at the Cochran Firm, California.
And keep up the great work. We are very proud of you. For our law student, she's going to be buried in books, but tell us about maybe a group or two that you're involved with at Loyola Law School, and how can law students and others who are interested in going to law school find you?
So at Loyola Law School, I am a member of the Black Law Student Association. I'm actually the former president, so I was the president last year, but as a dual law student and business student, it's hard to spend a lot of time on campus since I'm on two different campuses, both the business school and the law school. But I'm also a student ambassador at Loyola Law School, so I do give tours to different students who are interested in attending Loyola. In addition to that, I do create content for students who are interested in law school, so insight in preparing for the LSAT, the application process, and just the day in the life of a law student. And you can find that content on YouTube at Talking with Timaiah. Talking with, and then the spelling is Timaiah. So
Perfect. And I remember my BALSA days. Yeah. BALSA is a wonderful organization. That's the Black Law Student Association, and it definitely helped me to get through law school and pass the bar exam. So kudos. We're going to end with In the News. So the first three segments I had on a black robe, and I tried to reach out through the screen to any entity that will hire me as a TV judge. But I've been told to remain lawyerly. So today I'm in a suit. We're not going to do May It Please the Court, but if you know Byron Allen, yes, I live in LA and you can call me. But until then, we're going to focus on legal journalism, and how we will do that is a segment after each discussion called In the News. And what I do is I pick a case that's been in the news related to the topic today. And the topic today was product liability and toxic torts. Our daily legal word was torts, so I found a torts case. And it's Monsanto's Roundup weed killer. Many of you may have remembered this case from last summer, and I'll start. This is from CNN. So San Francisco jurors just ruled that Roundup, the most popular weed killer in the world, gave a former school groundkeeper terminal cancer. So they awarded him $289 million in damages, mostly to punish the agricultural company Monsanto. Dwayne Johnson's victory Friday could set a massive precedent for thousands of other cases claiming Monsanto's famous herbicide causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So Johnson's case was the first to go to trial because doctors said he was near death. And in California, dying plaintiffs can be granted expedited trials related to a product liability and toxic tort case. So I'd like to end by asking my guests one by one, do you agree with this decision, and was the jury verdict outrageous?
Well, it depends.
We knew you would say
yes,
that.
it's hard because, you have a jury of 12 people who came to some amount of consensus about this, having heard all the evidence, having seen the plaintiff's testimony, having heard the counter arguments and the arguments, and they believe that this was just and that it was fair and that it properly punished the defendant if that was a part of their case. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's not outrageous to me, knowing what I know.
Perfect. And did you follow the case and hear about it when it came out last year?
Yes, I did. And when I was mentioning non-Hodgkin's lymphoma earlier, it's the Roundup chemical that I was thinking about, and Monsanto as the defendant I was thinking about.
See, we have synergy. Love this group. Thank you. Dr. James, what do you think about that verdict in the case?
Well, I would kind of defer to answer that kind of question just because medically we don't necessarily get into law issues per se. We just want to make sure we treat the patient and do what's best for the patient.
So I will ask you another question, and you don't have to answer as a doctor. You can answer as a human being. Okay. Do you think that even if someone has been awarded $289 million, if you're near death, can that truly compensate for the fact that he may more than likely die anyway?
As a person, no, that doesn't. What it does is help the family financially for the loss of the family member. So.
And I know that you had mentioned before in terms of health, and that's our most valuable commodity. So thank you for your comments. I'd like to end with our law student, legal precedent. Do you think this case will set legal precedent and hopefully punish other companies who may engage in this behavior?
I honestly do hope that it will, and I do honestly think that it will, just even from a business school background. As a company, you are the person who can avoid this harm. You have the technology, you have the information, so when you're putting your products out on the marketplace, you should be ready and willing to take responsibility for whatever the repercussions may be, especially when lives are harmed from it. So I hopefully hope that this will create a precedent and really push these companies to do better research and really have better information about what products they're putting on the marketplace.
You are going to be a great litigator, young lady.
Oh my goodness, thank you.
So with that, we are going to end today. So Tony, thank you again for doing a great job. Before we end, I would like to thank our sponsor, Cochran Firm California, and of course, happy to work with Tony here at UB and Go. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye now.